and odd. Lovely. Simon, Mike, great to see everybody. Okay, well, yeah, if there's no other questions, I think we just go ahead and kick this off. I got, we saw the note from Chris. I think he's stuck on the subway in New York and has to teach, soon anyway, so he might or might not be joining us. But hey, welcome everyone. This day in some ways has been a long time coming, because my goodness, it was quite the process, as it always is, right, with edited volumes. But I have to say, such a joyous process to see these chapters, come together, and today to get to celebrate a bit of their coming out party. I wish I could now provide a link to where you can view our new, open access edited volume from Cambridge University Press. It's not out quite yet in terms of being live. The last update I saw was just in about 2 months. It looks like it's slated for early May for the final publication, but we had this slot assigned, so we're going to run with it. And we're hoping that this discussion will give you all, a chance to kind of look behind the curtain and learn more about some of the just really compelling, groundbreaking work that all the authors and of course the co-editors did in this project. To give you a sense for what it looks like, I'll just kind of tease. Here is the cover. So at least we have that sorted. And the idea itself has come about, I think, from a variety of different factors. And, for Frederic, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'm going to pass the baton in just a moment if you feel like it. And of course, it was for the special thanks to Chris as well, Ankerson from NYU, for doing so much of the heavy lifting here. But, the idea of, at its simplest terms, was there hadn't yet been an edited volume, a kind of collective effort to unpack this concept of what the heck do we mean, by cyber peace? What lessons can we learn from other analogies, other historical periods? As we're seeing now play out, unfortunately, before our eyes, it's never been more important, frankly, to think about a lot of these issues of peace building, of civilian critical infrastructure protection, you name it. So what we're hoping to do in this book club event today is to talk a little bit about, the edited volume first, kind of some of our ideas of it, and then give you a chance to hear from the authors themselves to see how they approached, thinking about writing about this topic. And then, per usual, we'll open up for a general discussion from there. So we'll pause as we go through each chapter as well, in case there's other, questions, ideas that come about. So that's just kind of a very quick and dirty introduction to kind of what we're after here. This process began, my goodness, back before the pandemic. We actually had a bit of a cyber peace colloquium launch in New York, thanks to our friends at NYU, as part of the, what was that, part of the UN General Assembly week? Frederic, I can't even remember. That was like
I think it was November or December 2019.
Okay, so a bit after. My goodness, yeah, which was a wonderful, it was a, multi-stakeholder gathering to start some of these dialogues. And we were supposed to obviously physically convene after that, but of course, because of the pandemic, it's all been virtual, but we've had some wonderful workshops along the way. So, from there, I'm wondering, Frederic, do you have any other kind of introductory thoughts, and maybe introduce yourself and Geode as well? Because I mean, this is such a fantastic organization. And then, from there, we can just start running through.
Thank you so much, Scott. So my name is Frederic Douzet. I'm the director of GEOD, which is a center of research and education on the strategic challenges of the digital revolution. And I'm really happy that this book is coming out now, because I think it's really timely. We saw that in the conflict in Ukraine, for the first time, a state actually called for manipulating data routing and DNS for war purpose. So I think we do need to talk about peace, and particularly cyber peace as well. I just want, as an introduction, to really thank Scott, because it seems like it's the three of us who edited the volume, but Scott actually did all the heavy lifting, and I know Chris agrees with me. So thank you for your leadership and enthusiasm, and that definitely kept us busy and happy during the lockout. I wish we could have done more of these workshops in presence. It would have been more fun, and we would probably have been able to share more thoughts. But I would like to thank all the authors for their support, because everybody played by the rules and participated in the online workshop and constantly improved their chapters. And I think it's quite a great book in the end. So thank you.
I couldn't agree more, Frederica. And it's been just such a pleasure working with you, and Chris and everybody that you're going to hear from today. And of course, all the other chapter authors. We've assembled, quite the cadre. It's been fantastic to see these contributions mature. As you'll see, there's a whole host of academics from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds, world institutions from around the world, as well as practitioners, some civil society groups. I'll pull up a list for the table of contents so you have a good sense for kind of how the whole thing breaks down. But for this next section, I think if it's okay, guys, we're just going to run through more or less in the order that the chapters appear in the edited volume. Of course, we only have the time to do a couple of these right now, but we're lucky to be joined by several of these authors. So I'm wondering, Renee, not to put you too much on the spot, but since, your contribution's up first in the edited volume, maybe we could start with you. And of course, please let me give a not good enough introduction to Renee. So Renee Marlon Bennett, an amazing scholar in her in a variety of fields, frankly, not just these days talking about cyber peace, of course. She is at Johns Hopkins. And has had an amazing, career as a political science professor. Her research really, my goodness, these days could not be more timely, looking at, global power politics, information flows, borders, and bodies. And she's been really a leader in this field, and we're so thankful for her to be involved in this edited volume. So Renee, over to you.
I think being a leader kind of started with being just old enough to have been there at the beginning, and having had the luck to realize, oh, this is the internet is a new sort of global phenomenon that's going to have political impacts, and we really need to start thinking about it. So just sort of age is starting to write about the politics of the internet way back in the early 90s was just luck. But I wanted, as a consequence of having that sort of long view, I wanted to do a little bit of conceptual brush clearing in this chapter. Cyber peace sounds really good. We all like peace. We all like cyber. But it wasn't actually clear what it was, despite the articulation of 4 pillars. So the first pillar is that cyber peace respects human rights and freedoms. Okay, so these are abstractions instantiated in law and take form through the practice of governments, right? That's how we get human rights and freedoms. And then the second pillar was spreads internet access along with best cybersecurity practices. So this next pillar is about a diffusion of technology and technical standards. Okay. 3 was strengthens governance mechanisms by fostering multi-stakeholder collaboration. Well, 3 was a preference for a certain kind of governance. Okay, well, that's interesting, but have we really kind of stress tested whether multi-stakeholder governance is going to do for us what we needed to do, if that's a sufficient approach or not? And 4, promotes stability and relatedly sustainable development. And this again was another technical practice, a technical issue, and it pivoted to sustainability. So in some ways, these 4 pillars didn't hang together. They were referring to conditions of cyber peace. So within cyber peace, you can have cyber war, and you can have cyber peace. Within cyberspace, you can have cyber peace or cyber war, or perhaps even like cyber skirmishes. Or maybe there's a condition of cyber peace as a kind of peace. So the big concept is peace, and there's geo-peace and geopolitical peace and environmental peace and economic peace. And cyber peace is one of these different kinds of peace. And in that case, the big concept is a really expansive notion of peace with justice. Or maybe cyber peace isn't a condition, it's a set of practices. And here we have practices of peacemaking, of maintaining stability of information technology systems, and also cyber defense. So cyber defense gets put in there too. How do we recover from aggressive actions that break the cyber peace? So the chapter teases these apart and sort of asks questions about, is it possible to combine conditions and practices and lead to a coherent, useful concept? Should we drill down into further refining the concept? Should we be questioning its components? The challenges that I posed in the chapter were inspired by an intervention in the early 1980s by an international relations scholar named Susan Strange. And she railed against a new concept as imprecise and woolly. And basically, when I looked at the way in which different uses of the term cyber peace were being bandied about, I was worried that that's where we're headed. And the chapter urges a more coherent, careful understanding of what cyber peace is.
Spot on, Renee. And I thought you did it just frankly so effectively. And I apologize for the uninitiated. I think probably should have laid a little bit more groundwork before we jumped in there. But Renee artfully, I think, walked through, several different, conceptions, starting points for understanding this idea. And obviously thinking about peace, we have to think about a lot of different, historical epics contexts, including this idea of negative peace, right? Which is a starting point for thinking about a lot of not only, cybersecurity, but other issues. In other words, the end of cyber attacks. And that was, not on the table. I think we all agreed pretty quickly. That'd be great, of course, but really just not going to happen. So one particularly useful contribution, Renee, I felt like in your volume was kind of tracking historically, how the term, had been used by the Vatican and otherwise. Just to give you guys a flavor, here's a quick list. There you are. From the Vatican and the World Federation of Scientists, back in 2008, they had, some highfalutin language about this universal order of cyberspace built on this wholesale state of tranquility. Sounds great, right? Especially these days, really unlikely. So that's why we tried to pivot in this volume to think about, well, what would a positive cyber peace look like, especially a positive cyber peace built on, some of the findings and methodological frameworks that the workshop was known for, including, these polycentric partnerships. Where can those work? Where do they fall short? And as you said, in particular, Renee, which I think is so spot on, to be really careful, with the language we're using here so that it's not so all encompassing, maybe something like sustainability even, right? We could argue that it doesn't really get us very far at the end of the day, which is why we're going to turn, toward the end of this series of quick presentations here to think more about how these ideas are being operationalized, including through the UN and through several multi-stakeholder processes. But I wanted to just kind of throw it out there just before we kind of move on, author by author here. Are there any quick, questions or comments for Renee? Anything anybody would like to bring up? We can return to it, of course, too. Yeah. Okay. And per usual, feel free to use the raise hand function or the chat function, whatever you're comfortable with. But that was so great. Thank you so much for that really, really helpful summary, Renee. And I found the table of contents for the book as well. Should have had that up already. So apologies there. And now I've lost it. Now I found it. Okay, here we are. So there we are. Okay. So I think next, if it's okay, Jess, I know that obviously Cyan, Frederica aren't on the line right now, but I'm sure they wouldn't mind you speaking for them here. So would love to hear about, your contribution in particular in the realm of digital repression. Also could be more timely given what we're seeing play out, unfortunately, in Ukraine and Russia right now.
Sure. Is it possible to share my screen? I just put a few.
Oh yeah.
Lines
No, please do.
Okay.
Please do. That'd be great.
Okay, great. Oh no, where'd it go?
I just did the same. I have too many things open.
What is happening? That's very odd. It's literally not. I'll have to close everything else and figure out why that's not the one showing up right now. Okay. I'm sorry about that. It's
No. Not at all. If you'd like, we can come back to you too. It's, this is totally flexible, informal,
well, I can also just like talk through it. That's also
whatever you prefer. Yeah.
fine.
No worries.
Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it. I'm sorry. I don't know. It wasn't showing up. Okay, so now you can see this.
Yeah, no, perfect.
Great. So, so this is just a piece that, as Scott mentioned, that Cyan Loyal and Federica and I wrote. They are both formerly of the Ostrom workshop and have now spread out, unfortunately. But we really had a wonderful time writing this piece and thinking about specifically domestic digital repression. And so the research question that sort of guided us in this chapter is, how are ICTs changing the way states interact with their citizens, specifically how they repress? And I should, I should be clear. We don't actually very clearly answer this question, right? We sort of say, okay, they alter the costs and benefits of the main repressive capacities of the state in an unpredictable way. But what we're really doing in this chapter is thinking sort of methodically about what it means to repress, what the specific capacities and requirement are for repression, and if that changes between sort of an analog and a digital world. So really quickly, what do we mean by repression? Right, we've just had this wonderful and sort of problematizing overview of cyber peace, and we really focus on the specific realm of behavior of repression, which in the political science literature is the actual or threatened use of physical violence against an individual or organization within a state for the purpose of imposing costs on the target and deterring specific activities believed or perceived to be threatening to the government. And we really sort of say this is comprised of both physical integrity violations, right? So physically harming or detaining or torturing citizens, as well as civil liberties violations as well. So we put these both in this basket. And then we sort of say, okay, well, we're going to build on that. We're going to actually use Scott's definition of digital repression to think about the coercive use of information and communication technologies by the state to exert control pretty much in the same way, right? And these kinds of things might include digital surveillance, biometric monitoring, misinformation campaigns, and state-based hacking. And I should say, just to be clear, I think it's probably a shared understanding here, but we're really talking about the forms of information communication technologies that facilitate two kinds of activities. So access to new and potentially diverse sources of information and near instantaneous communication among individual users, right? So that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the internet, cellular service or cellular technology, et cetera. Okay, so what do we do in this chapter? Okay, so this is just a summary chart of what we attempt to do, which is really the sort of mapping. It's sort of a conceptual mapping exercise to say, okay, if we break down repression into its component parts, what does that look like? And so we suggest that repression requires identifying a threat, which is usually information gathering of some sort. It requires actual expertise or tactical expertise to address or neutralize that threat, right? So it's a skill set is really what we're talking about. It also requires agents, so responsive agents to carry out that skill set, that expertise. And finally, what we might call an infrastructure of repression. And this can be the sort of physical, geographic, or network characteristics that make it more or less costly to engage in repression. Okay, and so in the analog world, right, threat identification might involve actually physically going somewhere or speaking to someone to gather cultural, linguistic, or geographic data, right? Tactical expertise might involve like surveillance or actual torture strategies, right? Or even, or simply sort of knowing how to, having a, for instance, a counterinsurgency task force that is actually considers themselves experts in addressing or neutralizing threats, right? What does that skill set look like? It also requires, again, this sort of responsive agents in the analog world. This might be specifically police or the military, right? Or even security. And then this infrastructure of repression, we're really talking about, again, in the analog world, the sort of prisons, detention facilities, even road networks that facilitate access to actually operate and to carry out counterinsurgent or sort of repressive measures. Right? We could even think of this as sort of James Scott and the sort of building of roads in Paris as a way to ensure order. Right? And so if we then think about the sort of way in which these capacities, these components of repression might manifest in sort of a digital repression world, right? We're really, when it comes to threat identification, we're thinking about large volumes of information and new types of information and real-time monitoring in ways that we couldn't really do beforehand. When it comes to tactical expertise, this is going to be more about sort of technological know-how and the sort of reservoir of expert knowledge as it pertains to sort of maintenance and use of ICT systems. When it comes to responsive repressive agents, right, this is particularly interesting because instead of a immediate sort of security apparatus associated with the state, we also have to think about the ways in which states sort of compel telecommunications companies or internet providers to, for instance, shut down the internet or limit access to the internet for specific actors. And then finally, infrastructural repression, right, in the analog world I mentioned is sort of could be thought of as prisons and detention facilities, but in the digital world, we could think about this actually still as a physical infrastructure that might be cellular towers, the fiber optic cables and data centers and internet exchanges that actually facilitate real-time communication and the transfer of information. And so all of this is to say, as I mentioned, this was really a conceptual mapping exercise. And so we suggest that governments really do both digital repression and traditional or analog repression. And then we really need to think about how these components help us understand the possibility of substitutions versus complementary effects, sorry for the spelling there, as well as sort of how this might change the costs and benefits of doing one, the other, or both as a way of controlling population. So I will stop there because I'm not sure if that was 5 minutes or not, but I certainly don't want to take away time from anybody else. I'm happy to talk through sort of how we're thinking about those things. But thanks for your time.
No, thank you, Jess. That was outstanding. I love it. I know we want to make sure I have plenty of time for discussion at the end too, but any questions, comments for Jess? Yeah, Renee, please.
So I don't want to keep taking up time, but I am fascinated just by the slide, which shows how the one of the analog, just the threat detection part of the analog was also sort of normal policing, making sure of social order, right? But then all of the things that were in the digital column are also things that are used and can be used for cyber peace purposes of responding to threat. And that was a tension that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that is fascinating and important to sort of start exploring is the extent to which there may be trade-offs between digital and internet, like domestic and international cyber peace and digital repression in this regard. And so I think Renee, you're sort of starting to suggest we need to think about these overlaps and whether, again, they sort of might be trade-offs or complementarities or what that might look like. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Renee. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, Frederick.
Yeah, Frederick, please. Yeah.
I think what's fascinating with the crisis now is that we have calls for blocking the internet on both sides, thinking that it's going to help the problem. I mean, one side is arguing that we should cut off the internet for the Russians so that they don't, in order to impose sanctions, while others worry that Russia might cut itself off from the internet and then prevent people from reaching out their families. So it's interesting because the same actions seems to be perceived on the one hand as something that can help one side, whereas it's perceived as hurting the same side by others. So it's talking about trade-offs. I think there are many trade-offs to any decision regarding using cyber means for repression.
Absolutely, Frederick. Thanks for bringing that home for us. Unfortunately. Okay, excellent. Well, just in the interest of time, and I know some people have to leave a little bit early for teaching and other obligations, we'll just keep rolling. That was wonderful, Jess. I think next on my list, and I know you have to leave a bit early as well, Jennifer, is you. So if you're willing, we'll turn to your contribution, the criminalization of cyber attacks under the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute. And Jennifer Trahan is a law professor at NYU and an expert, of course, in the ICC, which might get a lot of work based on what we're seeing very soon. So Jennifer, please.
It might. Well, thanks so much. I'm sure all of you on the call have read Talon 1.0, 2.0. I was reading it and seeing it acknowledge that cyber attacks can, in certain circumstances, be a war crime. So the moment I read that, I'm like, okay, the International Criminal Court potentially has a role here. And then as I thought about it, well, it has a potential role regarding genocide, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. So that is what my chapter is looking at. I wrote it in parallel with serving on the Council of Advisors for the application of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to cyber warfare. And we meanwhile came out with our report, and I can put the link in the chat. And this was convened at the mission of Liechtenstein, but was gathering cyber experts and International Criminal Court experts together, and sponsored by 10 other states. So they cover some of the same territory and somewhat inspired my writing. And maybe I inspired them. I don't know. I won't claim that much. In fitting into Scott's idea of cyber peace, I started my chapter on the idea of deterrence. So, the idea being ideally, you don't want to give the International Criminal Court business. You don't want it to have a lot of crimes to prosecute, but you actually want to deter crimes. Now, when you look at Ukraine today, you kind of feel pessimistic about deterrence because the court has jurisdiction over war crimes and crimes against humanity there, and it looks like nobody's being deterred. Of course, if someone were being deterred, we wouldn't see it because deterrence is the absence of something occurring. But I think deterrence is really difficult against certain individuals. So anyway, to the extent we can maximize deterrence, first, if cyber is part of these crimes, this has to be acknowledged. And this report is starting to do this. I participated in a couple book launches on this. I think we still need to get the word out more. And the prosecutor needs to start to get the word out more. And maybe people will see this with the events in Ukraine as they see cyber potentially playing a role in war crimes and the crime of aggression. So I started my chapter with a consideration of what is the gravity threshold of the International Criminal Court. So the court only prosecutes the most grave crimes. So not all war crimes. So you have to reach this gravity threshold. So then I was pondering, well, what is a more grave cyber attack? And I just started with Talon 2.0's definition of what is an armed attack, which is a cyber operation that seriously injures or kills a number of persons or that causes significant damage to or destruction of property. So that's kind of my starting point. I suggest might be where the court would want to start. But maybe further thought needs to be put into destruction of data or catastrophic systems attacks. And then once maybe that result in serious injuries or property damage, and those that don't, but those are areas I think warrant more thought. So that's one of the limitations of the Rome Statute. Another one is attribution. And for International Criminal Court purposes, it is an attribution to a state. It is attribution to probably someone's computer and the person operating the computer. So it becomes really much more complex. I know the court has no cyber expertise at all. And I think they're going to have to get some very, very quickly and start to get up to speed on these kinds of issues, either hiring internally or secondment from outside experts, which may carry some pitfalls, but I think they need to deal with that. It's not in my book chapter, but just because events are unfolding now, just to say, the court has jurisdiction over the war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine, and it looks like a lot of war crimes are being committed. The court doesn't have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression because the US narrowed that jurisdiction in the negotiations in 2010 in Kampala, Uganda, and then France and UK narrowed the jurisdiction further in 2017. So very ironically, 3 of the allies at Nuremberg who spearheaded prosecutions of the crime of aggression have narrowed the jurisdiction. So now the court can't use it against Russian nationals. So, all right, so there's, laying blame, but where do we go from here? I do have a proposal, and I can put the link in the chat as well, for the GA recommending the negotiation of a tribunal on the crime of aggression, to handle the crime of aggression. It would be agreed between the UN and the government of Ukraine. And that has happened for both the Cambodia and Sierra Leone special courts. So we could have an aggression tribunal, and I think cyber played a role in the aggression, particularly the cyber attacks that were just prior to the launch of the Russian invasion. My chapter ends, and I'll end my remarks here by just saying, as how giving out ideas how a cyber attack can be part of a war crime, crime against humanity, genocide, or crime of aggression. In terms of a war crime, I was at that point writing about earlier cyber attacks into Ukraine. I have much more to write about, unfortunately, today. On crimes against humanity, I wrote about like a cyber 9/11. So if the planes were brought down solely without, we don't need hijackers potentially. In genocide, I wrote about Burmese military posts on Facebook inciting genocide. And the crime of aggression, I think my example was rather generic. I think we have a better example now with Russian cyber attacks on Ukraine, followed by the what I would say is the crime of aggression, even though we're having difficulties figuring out how to exercise jurisdiction over that. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really, really well done. Questions, comments, reflections for Jennifer? Anything jumping? That was really, really interesting. And I'm so glad that this is getting the attention it deserves. And I think you're going to be very much in demand, unfortunately, Jennifer, over the next couple of years in particular. So am I right that was it Latvia or no, Lithuania who already referred, for ICC investigation to some of the incidents?
And then we had 38 additional states joining.
Oh, really? Okay, I'm behind. I'm sorry.
We have never actually had that many states. We've had referrals of crimes made by one country. And in the case of Venezuela, we had 5 countries referring the situation. And now we've had 39 countries refer the situation. That allowed the prosecutor to skip a procedural step of going to the pretrial chamber for approval to open his investigation. He could just open the investigation, which he has. And of course, what you want is the prosecutor saying, we're opening this investigation. You'd like to see somebody being deterred by that. And, not seeing a lot of that. Maybe Russian nationals are just calculating, well, they'll just go back to Russia. And even if the ICC issues warrants, they'll just hang out in Russia and they'll never see The Hague. But as I've been saying I've been on a number of panels on these topics, I think Milosevic and Karadzic and Mladic and Charles Taylor never thought they would see courtrooms. So I don't think in this day of accountability, anyone should think, well, we're just above the law and, and we'll rest secure. And there's also, if the ICC isn't out there, a lot of courts have domestic war crimes legislation, and some have a crime of aggression legislation on their books. And some of those have universal jurisdiction. So it doesn't matter where the crime occurred. So it's not just the ICC that's out there, there are also domestic jurisdictions. So unfortunately, I think there will be a lot of follow-up justice that will be needed for prosecutions of what we see unfolding now.
I couldn't agree more, but I'm heartened to see such institutional support for the ICC across such a broad, cross section of the world. That's great. So hope, as you say, hopefully accountability will have its day here. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I know you have to run pretty soon to teach. So this is great. I'm just looking down our list here, and I saw Adam in the room. I don't want to call you out, Adam, so we can come back to you as well. But if you'd like to say anything about your and Rob's chapter on diverse verifiers as a prerequisite to cyber peace, feel free. And if not, we can move on to Frederic and Odd's chapter.
Sure, I can throw my camera on and say a couple of words.
Okay, Adam. Yeah. Again, sorry to put you on this, but I don't feel like you have to, go into a lot of depth. But wonderful to have you guys. Adam Shostak has done quite a lot with his career in cybersecurity, moving on after a decade at Microsoft to do tremendous amount of training, of consulting, a lot of deep thinking on these topics, including recently a great report from the Belfer Center on the idea of this cybersecurity review board, kind of modeled after the NTSB. So anyway, Adam, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I hate to be super focused on the events of the day, but I will be. One really interesting aspect of the conflict is that we are seeing a lot of claims from Anonymous about cyber hacking. We're not seeing necessarily a lot about what the main participants in the conflict have been doing. And is the question that I ask, which I think we draw out in the chapter, is, are we not seeing this because nothing is happening in the cyber domain? Or are we not seeing it because what's happening is hidden and we don't have the sensor systems that can tell us there's a real uptick? And so to me, that lack of ongoing data gathering impacts my ability to understand and assess what's happening. And so I hope that in the future, we just have more ongoing knowledge of the state of the world so that we can contextualize either an uptick or maybe there's been a shift to defensive work. I was just reading about these US covert cyber units, which are nominally doing something. What are they succeeding at? So my hope is that we'll see more of that with time. And thank you for letting me speak for a minute. Appreciate it.
Oh no, thank you, Adam. And you're co-author, Rob Benacki as well. Also, a force to be reckoned with. So it was so great to work with you guys throughout this process. And thanks for those thoughts as well. And as you say, kind of all these recent late breaking developments, my goodness. Excellent. So as we said in the chat there, we'll turn to Frederic. I know you're not feeling well. So Odd, if you'd like to kind of, take control there for the next chapter, which we'll be discussing. And that will be the title there, Building Cyber Peace While Preparing, as we just said, unfortunately, and these days executing cyber war. And among other things, really helpful chapter since it gives us some late breaking developments on the international diplomacy around cybersecurity norms efforts through the UN and otherwise.
Thank you very much, Scott, and hi, everyone. Well, I must say on behalf of my two co-authors, Frédéric and François Delarue, that we're really proud of the title of the chapter. And when Frédéric came with the title, Building Cyber Peace While Preparing Cyber War, we found that it was the perfect expression to describe what's going on within the United Nations when we talk about cyber diplomacy. When you look at cyber diplomacy, you see that multilateralism as a method of cooperation is well alive. We have more than 70 UNGA resolutions and reports. We have 4 GG reports, 1 working group reports, And I must say that it was a big surprise to see that last year in March and May 2021, both the Open-Ended Working Group and the GG that were working on cybersecurity ICTs in the context of international security came to an agreement and adopted by consensus a report. We also have a proposal for a program of action that is led by Egypt and France and supported by 52 states. And we also have a lot of initiatives outside of the UN. For example, the OECD is very, very active, especially on the issue of vulnerability treatment and the security of the supply chain. We have the Paris Call for Trust and Security, or more recently had a new initiative led by the US as part of the Summit for Democracy called Export Controls and Human Rights Initiative. And yet, we're really far from cyber peace because we see that the number of cyber attacks keeps increasing, that offensive capabilities are being modified and reused by both states and non-state actors, that they are backfiring, and that the arms race is getting more and more problematic. So what we wanted to do in this chapter was to try to explain and to deconstruct this discrepancy between all these diplomatic talks and the realities. So what we try to do is to offer an analysis of the multilateral efforts conducted over the past decade. And what we show in the chapter is that states, while talking and negotiating within the UN, have never gave up on their offensive objectives, and nothing that has been achieved really managed to get to cyber peace and to prevent cyber war. And to show that, we took one case studies, which is the discussion around international law and normative influence. Because we had, when you look at how international law has been discussed within the UN processes, we see that from the beginning, from the first UNGA resolution, it has been a problem. And then we had, I'll call it the golden age of cyber diplomacy between 2009, 2015, where, for example, in 2013, the GG acknowledged that international law, and in particular the UN Charter in its entirety, applies to states' conduct in cyberspace. And we almost forgot that international law was a big issue of disagreement among states. And then after this golden age of cyber diplomacy, the fifth GG in 2017 reminded us that actually states disagreed over international law because they have different strategic agenda. And this is well explained in the different statements by the US representative at the GG or the Russian or Cuban one. They have different strategic agenda, they have different perception of threats, different priorities, and this had a direct repercussion on the international discussions and more precisely on how they see international law and what normative influence they try to have. And the best example of that, and this is what we explain in the chapter, is that in 2018, for the first time since 1998, we didn't have one resolutions on ICTs in the context of international security, but we had two, one that created the GG and one that created an open-ended working group. And here again, and in detail, we explain that in the chapter, when you read the two resolutions, you see that there are two different visions of international law and international regulation. We also see that at some point, and we explained that as well, non-state actors try to get into the big game of cyber diplomacy, including on international law issues. But that didn't work very well, we must say. And I think it's pretty interesting to see that because we've heard for the past couple of days that international law is dead. At least some people said that it cannot prevent terrible events to happen. But we see actually, whether it is in the cyber world or outside of the cyber world, that international law is well alive, that states fight over it, that they fight for it, even when they bluntly violate it. And this is exactly what we see also within the negotiation at the UN on cyber issues. But behind all this appearance of having two different visions of international law and international regulation, what we demonstrate is that the reality is much more nuanced, because we have two blocks if we only focus on major cyber powers, but we see that most of the states, most of UNGA, most of the UN member states actually did not take any side either for the US or for the Russian Federation. And we went a bit further, because when we were writing the chapter, the Open-Ended Working Group and the GG had not yet finished their work. They were actually in the middle of their mandates, and I must say that we were very pessimistic about their chances of success. We were wrong, at least in appearance, but apart from the content of the discussions and the disagreements on whether or not we need new rules of international law, we were seeing a competition for normative influence through discussions on the format of the future of discussions. And this is the case study that we detail the most in the chapter. At the time where we wrote the chapter, France and Egypt, voted by 52 states, as I said, were making a proposal for a program of action, a permanent dialogue that is action-oriented, and they were doing that as part of the mandate of the Open-Ended Working Group. And they were proposing this new POA, and at the same time, the Russian Federation was preempting the results of the discussion and proposing to the UNGA resolution, a resolution creating a new Open-Ended Working Group. And the votes and the discussions within the UN First Committee, but also the UNGA, was super interesting to study, because we saw that the Russian Federation, which used to have a very strong normative influence, actually lost some influence, while the US and the EU gained some. And the most interesting thing was to see the changes of position of some BRICS member states. But again, we had some changes from major, I would say, middle cyber power states, but we saw that just like in 2018, most of the UN member states did not take sides, and we still had some kind of, big opposition between a couple of states, but we saw that most of UN member states didn't take any position whether or not there should be one initiative on another. So what does it tell us of the ways that cyberspace is being built? We see that there are strong disagreements between major powers, but the idea of having two blocks isn't accurate and should be nuanced. And so, again, for future work on cyber diplomacy, it really shows that if you want to build cyber peace, you will have to convince all these states that what you want to achieve is what they should fight for. The second thing that this work, the study of these different initiatives and the different votes showed us is that security and stability actually isn't really the priority of states. Influence and normative power are, and normative power is really being seen as one tool for strategic superiority. And all this work around influencing the discussions, the content and the format of the discussion led to a situation where the content had less importance than the format. and where states were actually preserving their sphere of influence and action to advance their strategic objectives, instead of really building cyber peace and trying to restrain themselves.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I mean, again, just it's amazing how much the world changed just during the writing of this chapter, which gives you some sense for, how quickly this field is maturing, hopefully, but definitely emerging. Questions, comments?
Maybe if I can,
please, yeah.
Yeah, add something, because what's interesting, and the question is not discussed in the same framework at the United Nations, because it's a slippery slope for democracies, but clearly reflecting on this chapter and the chapter that was presented before, we see that this type of confrontation extends beyond what we call cyber peace here to also disinformation or informational influence, cyber enabled, and that's definitely a new field of confrontation. I mean, it's both an old and a new field, but it's we're mentioning that we're not sure whether we're not seeing the cyber attacks or whether they're not happening. There's one thing that we see, and that's happening big time, which is manipulations of information and influence, and that's a very tricky one to address regarding international law, but that's definitely something we need to look into, because it's now really not only it happens, but now states claim that they're legitimate to use information operations as one of the tools in that great competition and confrontation between powers.
Fantastic. Thank you. Oh yeah, Simon, please. Then we'll move on to Anne. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a very good question. I like the idea of like confrontation, the idea that this is challenging like current ideas. So I want to focus on the idea of internet sovereignty itself. I'm from Taiwan. Taiwan recently passed legislated adopt a law that stresses internet sovereignty, and the reason was to kind of to deal with cyber attacks that happens from China. So and then there's this trend of internet sovereignty. So the question is, do you see the idea of cyber peace as a direct challenge or alternative to internet sovereignty on like a bigger level there? Thank you.
Well, I wouldn't say that cyber peace is a challenge for digital sovereignty. I would say that one of the reasons we have so many discourses around digital sovereignty is because states are not able to achieve cyber peace. So there is a sense that we need to try to regain some control over what's happening over the internet. I think the discourses around sovereignty are a consequence of the lack of cyber peace.
Thank you so much.
And interestingly, it's not the states that are in a position of leadership that are promoting cyber sovereignty. It's more the states that feel threatened by what's going on and want to make sure that they can defend their ability to protect either their country or their political regime.
Thank you for the answer.
And I know, Anne, I'm so sorry we're this short on time, and to everybody, because I'll respond to your question, Jamie, in the chat. But Anne, please, let's hear about some of the many empirical hurdles facing researchers who are interested in studying cybersecurity and cyber peace.
Thanks, Scott. In light of the fact that we're coming up on the hour, I'm going to do the 90-second version of this talk as opposed to the 6-minute version. So thank you for having me. It's been really great to discuss this project. It's been so fascinating to hear about everyone else's work. Our chapter, which was written by me and Scott, focuses on identifying and overcoming barriers to empirical cyber research. So many of the questions that have been raised today are normative and theoretical. So what is right to do? How do we even define cyber peace? But there's also a lot of empirical questions, or there's situations in which normative questions can really be informed by empirical research. So for example, if we're interested in deterring individual actors, that's an empirical question. Whether or not we can deter them by certain kinds of interventions is something we can inform empirically, although it would not obviously be the entire conversation. Empirical questions could be qualitative or quantitative, and there's a lot of interesting ones here. While empirical cyber research has been done and continues to be done, it's nowhere near as common as it is in other areas. So we don't have the empirical body of work that we have in something like crime research or we have in health research. And so part of the reason for that is that there's special barriers in this context. So what we do is we identify them and we kind of talk about how to overcome them. And so we highlight 3 potential barriers. Cyber decisions are difficult to observe, which is, I think, is something that's come up repeatedly during this conversation about the fact that we don't have good data on a lot of these things, and good data would really help kind of inform a lot of this conversation. Empirical cyber research frequently requires expertise from multiple domains. So you may need someone who has more technical expertise in order to understand some of the issues, or certain types of technical data collection can be useful, but require certain types of expertise, whereas you may need someone with more traditional social science expertise to do some of the research design, survey writing and things like that. And research may only be possible in a narrow range of contexts. So there's a lot of circumstances under which we have one data point. We know how many, like the Manhattan DA's office releases some numbers, although they're very questionable about the frequency with which they obtain encrypted devices, or police officers or encrypted devices are obtained in their cases. But the entire world is not Manhattan. And so understanding how this works more broadly requires a much broader input. And so those are kind of some of the key issues. And so we talk about mechanisms for overcoming these barriers. So specifically incentivizing interdisciplinary research teams through targeted grants, understanding the value of interdisciplinary research during promotion and tenure, developing key partnerships. So this is something that Scott and I have been able to do, or when we were developing, we were doing empirical research on cybersecurity organizational decision making in Indiana. We were able to partner with the Indiana AG's office to distribute a survey. And then finally, this is, I think, the most important one and where I'll leave off. There's a real need to publish cyber-related data. So if you build it, they will come. And so kind of getting more numbers out there, getting them more easily available so it's not a huge lift anytime someone does research would really help spur the field. Over the short term, facilitating cyber-related data could look something like a really good annotated bibliography of current data sources with potential considerations for using them in research, which would make the data that do exist more available. But over the longer term, we're going to need something like the UCR for cyber. The Uniform Crime Reports for cyber. We're going to need something like repeatable measures over time and organizations in order to use some of the kind of more advanced statistical techniques we would want to use this context. But there's a lot of potential upsides as well. So finally, just to conclude, even though there's a number of barriers, a lot of these barriers are really political or deal with organizational will rather than kind of scientific limitations, although those also do exist. And so kind of approaching them from that perspective, we can hopefully make progress.
Extremely well done with 30 seconds to spare, right, Annie? I'm so sorry. And as well as for not giving you a proper introduction. So as I saw in the chat there, from the University of Arizona, and such a fantastic collaborator, really underscoring really the nature of this whole project, that we can't do very much unless we can break down these disciplinary, boundaries, work together on these really tough, complex, frankly, global collective action challenges. That's something that was so fun to do in this edited volume. And I think that's just such an important part of the secret sauce of the workshop as well. So I wish we had more time, because I think we could spend at least the next half an hour getting into some really fun questions. So I'll try to stand just for a few minutes in case anything comes up that's quite timely. Otherwise, we need to unfortunately head to the memorial service. But thank you all again. Maybe a round of applause to all of our fantastic authors. Of course, Frederic as well. Thank you guys. Such wonderful, wonderful work. And we'll be sure to spread the word as soon as everything goes live. Hopefully 2 months. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you to all.